fingers are so greasy.
And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Lucius Aurelian, and we are joined by New West Reset, and we're going to discuss old world connections in science fiction. And New West Reset, thank you so much for joining us on the Res Tutor Orbis channel.
Well, how's it going? Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate your time. Really been looking forward to this.
Very much so. And we've discussed that there are many old world connections when it comes to the science fiction connection. And I would certainly enjoy hearing about and discussing with you what you feel the greatest connections are to the old world with science fiction.
Well, what I had done was I'm looking at it from a Canadian perspective. So the research I did involved a couple of science fiction television series that were quite big here in Canada in the 70s. But then I expanded outward a little bit into the mid to late 80s because there was a very unique show that aired for a couple of seasons here in Canada that kind of went beyond the 1960s or 70s. But the very first one, interestingly enough, that I wanted to discuss is a children's science fiction adventure television series from 1979 up here in Canada called Read All About It. All about it? All about it. Anyway, it was aired from 1970. It was aired in 1979 and 1980, and it's a Canadian production. And basically, the premise of the television show was very strange. And I do have to also remark that these were condensed episodes. They were 15-minute long episodes. And here in Canada, we had a couple of children's television shows like that. For example, The Friendly Giant, which is another suspiciously titled children's television show that was also contained 50 or comprised of 15-minute episodes. But the premise of this show is very odd because it's about an 11-year-old boy who inherits his uncle's coach house 7 years after this boy's uncle has disappeared and has now been declared legally dead. So he's left this coach house in his will to his 11-year-old nephew with the stipulation that he's allowed to use it from the time he's 11 until he turns 21 when he becomes the legal owner, just so long as it's for a worthwhile cause. You can't just goof around in there with his friends and have a He-Man Women's Haters Club or something like that. It's got to be a worthwhile reason to use this coach house. So basically, I'll give you a quick synopsis of the show. This boy finds out he inherits the coach house from his uncle. So he goes with a couple of his friends, and he's given the key from the lawyer and a copy of the will that shows that he's entitled to enter. And they go in and they start exploring around in this old coach house that's behind his supposed deceased uncle's home. And it's built, the set design is built so that it resembles an old Victorian style carriage house, horse-drawn carriage, big arched windows, big arched doorways. And this uncle has now converted it to what has turned out to be some kind of mysterious laboratory inside this coach house where he's been doing technological experiments. So when they're exploring this coach house, these three young kids discover two artificial intelligence robots that had been invented by said missing uncle, and he's hidden them within this coach house.
Let me get this straight real quick, just to recover. So we have a Victorian coach house that has artificial intelligence within it, artificial robots.
Yes, artificial intelligence robots, two of them that have been invented and built by this uncle and hidden within this coach house. And they're discovered by these children.
Wow. All right. Just making sure those clear points are to me on the plot.
Well, it gets even better. Upon discovering these AI robots, they also discover that there's a porthole. It's a sort of a transporter within this coach house that contains a teleportation portal. And one of the children accidentally gets teleported to a far-off galaxy called Trialvaron. And there's this evil dictatorial ruler of this other galaxy known as Dunedin. And upon these children getting trapped by getting sucked through this transporter portal machine thing, they've got to solve word riddles. They've got to solve word riddles and puzzles in order to be able to transport themselves back to Earth, back to present time, back to the coach house. So it's a children's educational program. So, of course, they learn grammar and spelling. It's part of these word puzzles that these children have to solve. But that's only in the first episode. As we move through the episodes and through the season, this teleportation device ends up taking these children, sometimes just one, sometimes two or all three, depending on the episode, to different significant points of history in the past. For example, the War of 1812, or Sir Isaac Newton, or different events and people, and then associated with these events or these people that these children are transported to, there's always some kind of puzzle that if they do not solve, they will be trapped there. And as the episode of the show rolls out, these children solve this puzzle with the aid of these two AI robots. They can get back home. And the premise of the show is you learn about history, you learn a little bit of reading and writing and proper grammar, and it's all packed into this nice little package of a 15-minute episode. But
that's an amazing premise overall. I mean, just the premise of portal, artificial intelligence robots, being able to have unlimited travel, just to set up a 15-minute show.
Yes. It's I guess one could say very similar to Quantum Leap in a lot of ways, but it's obviously catered to a very young audience. Now, I don't remember watching this show as a child, but I remember my sister, who's younger than me, I remember her watching it. So in researching for this, I watched a couple of episodes, and it didn't really bring back any memories. But I found the artificially intelligent robots to be very interesting because there's two. And they're very autonomous, or seemingly very autonomous. They have free thought and free will, it seems, within this show. And I thought that was very advanced for a 1978, 1980 time period of children's television show that's produced up here in Canada.
Yeah, they're really pushing that premise far just for a children's television show.
And get this, the one AI robot's name is Otto, and he communicates by... He's sort of like a word processor or a computer printer. So he doesn't have a vocal way of communicating. He just prints whatever he says on a sheet of paper that's to be read aloud by the children. Whereas the other AI robot is named Theta. And she's sort of a integrated computer monitor where she can speak and hear you, but also keywords, phrases, or little short little paragraphs or series of sentences will appear on the screen. So I found it to be very, very interesting as well, because one AI is very obviously much more advanced and more sophisticated than the other. But the two work in conjunction with one another to help these children solve all of these riddles and puzzles in order to not be trapped in this far off galaxy by this Dunedin evil character. Now, the second premise of the show is that in order to be able to use this coach house, they have to come up with a worthwhile reason. So they decide to start a little newspaper, a kids point of view newspaper. That way they can poke around, ask questions about all the strange goings on in the town, because it's unveiled throughout the episodes that there's a conspiracy between the ruling class of the town, the mayors, and the higher business class in this town, and this Dunedin character who's posing as the mayor. So it's very, very strange because they're uncovering this conspiracy. But at the same, there's a lot going on in each episode. They're uncovering this conspiracy as this children newspaper reporters, but at the same time, they're having to go through all of these trials and tribulations by solving these riddles or puzzles to avoid being trapped by this evil Dunedin character. It's actually very creepy. I got some very unsettling feelings watching a couple of these episodes because I had to keep reminding myself the target audience, I would imagine, would be the age of the characters in the television show, 11-year-old children. And it was very off-putting in a lot of ways because this Dunedin villain is very unique looking. He's kind of a big giant floating head. It's basically played by an actor who's a good actor, but he does ham it up a bit. And they put this very metallic silver paint on him, sort of shades of the Tin Man and Wizard of Oz. And they just do this cheap visual effect of this floating head kind of idea whenever he appears in front of the children. It's very, very off-putting.
You know, that is something that was a little different in that time frame, 70s, 80s, is a lot of the content that was directed towards children had much more of an adult theme to it in multiple shows, in multiple lands, whether you're talking Canada, United States, United Kingdom. I think contemporaneously Doctor Who came under a lot of criticism because they said it was for children, but in the 70s they were pushing it, at least according to some people, too far with the content. Of course, now it's very, very tame within the time frame. The intense themes, like Brain of Mobius, where they're essentially doing Frankenstein and doing it very graphically in the mid-70s. I guess they felt that was pushing it too far. This sounds like the exact same premise and approach.
Yeah, and that's of course not to say that any children's television show should be dumbed down. The children are very intelligent and they pick up on things very easily and very quickly, obviously. And I agree with you when it comes to Doctor Who, because I grew up watching Doctor Who through the 1980s. I'm kind of a Tom Baker Doctor Who guy. But even into my teens, for a show that, like you had mentioned, was said to be slightly geared towards quite a young audience, into my teens and early 20s, I continuously watched as much Doctor Who as I had the opportunity to do so. It wasn't necessarily a drop everything you're doing Doctor Who is on, but pretty close. I was quite a fan of the show.
Oh yeah, I'm with you. I'd go out of my way to watch any of the Fourth Doctor Tom Baker episodes. I mean, and as the show went through its changes in quality, once they pulled out the producer Philip Hinchcliffe and brought in Graham Williams and then John Nathan Turner, you could tell the quality declined a little bit. But even with the decline in quality in the stories, you still had the intense performances. And let's be honest, Tom Baker could make an episode all by himself. So
yeah, he was definitely my favorite Doctor. I'd seen a few reruns of the previous Doctor. The actor's name escapes me, and those episodes were in black and white. But really, for whatever reason, I guess it's just because I kind of grew up with the Tom Baker version of Doctor Who that tends to be my favorite era, shall we say?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and all with the same premises. You can find all these old world premises where there was much more extensive, how shall we say, plot consequences to the characters, even on the most what appeared to be mundane actions, having such a profound implication on the plot. And then it was always so much more than just affecting the immediate characters. I always thought they wove that into the plot so effectively on shows like that in that time frame.
Yes, and a really effective show would have, they would be episodic, so they would wrap up a little bit of a story or subplot that would be specifically captured within the time period of that one episode, whether it's a 15-minute or a 22-minute episode or an hour-long episode or a two-parter, for example, right? But then they would also have larger story arcs that would leap across to the end of the entire season or series-wide, even larger story arcs. These are the hallmarks of really intelligently written television shows. They don't have to get too complicated with it. They just have to have a good story with good story arcs and good characters. And that's why a lot of these science fiction stories stand the test of time through the 60s, 70s, and even in some parts getting into the 1980s.
Oh, I completely agree. You could even argue that I would say it was the 1990s where we started to see the wider arcs. I mean, there were exceptions, but we saw a lot of the wider arcs and a little bit more of the prevalence of it start to be scaled back a bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But yeah, as you said, there's always exceptions. And speaking of the 80s, actually, the next series, if I may, that I wanted to discuss veers slightly away from what people might think of as being science fiction in terms of, let's say, I don't know, advanced technology or space travel or interdimensional beings or what have you. And this is more in the realm of mystery science fiction, kind of in the vein of the X-Files. And this was a show that is called Friday the 13th, the series. Now, it's not related at all to the Friday the 13th movie franchise with the hockey mask wearing serial killer. But they did definitely use that title to their advantage for a little bit of, shall we say, oomph in their publicity and in their promotion. But this was an excellent television show that aired here in Canada in the mid to late 1980s. And the premise of the show is that there's a young couple who buy an old antique shop, but they really have no use for all of these dusty old antiques. They basically just wanted the old building, which is another kind of old world structure, old world building that we often see in our types of explorations. Funny that, isn't it?
Oh,
But
yes.
anyway, they like the building, which is interesting enough. They have open eyes to the beauty of the building, but all the contents, all of these antiques, they basically consider these things clutter and dust collectors. So they sell them all off, only to realize later on that these are cursed or haunted items. The haunted China doll from the Victorian era, or the spooky old bicycle that rides itself down the street at midnight, or whatever the case may be. So they realize in the first episode of this television show that they've accidentally unleashed all of these cursed items upon the world. So now they've taken upon themselves to try to reclaim or regain or rebuy or somehow get a hold of these items and sort of release or relieve the world of all of these curses. The show aired for 3 seasons from 87 to 89, from 87 until 1990. And it was actually a very good production value television show. The effects were very, very good. And I think that was part of its demise, was just, again, an episodic television show. It just got to be a little bit too expensive. Plus, I think upon its original success or immediate success, the networks and advertisers had to start tinkering around with it a little bit. And ultimately, these things could end up cutting these shows off at the knees.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I very much remember Friday the 13th, the TV series, and I loved it. I actually preferred the concept of the TV series more than the hockey mask, machete wielding Jason. I thought it was much more intriguing. I mean, slasher flicks got a little boring for me, even then, I'm going to admit it.
Well, especially by the mid 80s and the mid to late 80s, we'd kind of seen it all, done it all when it came to the slashers born out of the late 60s, early 70s film genre, right? So, yeah, I enjoyed this show too. I liked the spooky X-Files aspect of it. I liked the sort of mysterious pseudo science fiction aspect of it, and all of these interesting legends. And the episode in particular that I kind of honed in on was episode 17 of the first season, called The Electrocutioner. And basically, this is an innocent man who's wrongly convicted of a crime and sentenced to death by the electric chair. He goes through all the steps where, they try to, appeal his conviction and so on, and nothing works. They march him down, they hook him up to the chair, they pull the switch, and initially he doesn't pass away from the first shock. So they shock him a second time, and he still doesn't pass. They shock him a third time, and they think, okay, third time's a charm. We got her there, buddy. He's good to go. So, they, call the time of death, and they unhook him from the chair, put him on a gurney. They're starting to wheel him out, and it turns out, no, he actually survived that third shock. So a few of the administrative staff are like, well, shock him again. Let's just keep shocking the poor bugger until he's, a roast duck, basically. But there's a few that say, look, he's already been declared dead. You can't, execute the same man twice. So we can't do this. It's against law. It's unconstitutional. Hey, wow, defending the Constitution. I guess they still did that in the 80s on television. Anyway, Um, so instead, the sort of pseudo-evil warden of the prison in which they attempted this execution says, well, I want to see what this did to him. So they send him off to a mental asylum, a state-sponsored mental institution. A very large Kirkbride-esque old world structure, of course, as you would guess.
Say it isn't so.
Absolutely. He spends 10 years there, and he supposedly is released. Upon release, he changes his name, and he assumes a new identity he becomes a dentist. But not just any dentist anywhere. Can you guess perhaps where he decided to gain employment as a dentist?
San Francisco.
Well, they don't stipulate what city, but I will tell you he becomes a dentist in a juvenile detention center.
Oh, nice. So another old world complex.
Yes. And then his dentist chair is actually the very chair that they tried to execute him with 3 times.
What are the odds?
So, of course, he's hooked up this chair and he's figured out how to modify this chair. He puts these young detention center teenage, troubled teens in the chair. And he gets them to let their guard down because he's sort of young and he kind of plays up the young hip. I'm kind of the cool, I'm kind of one of you. I'm not one of the establishment because I'm just the dentist here kind of role.
Right.
And he plays like cool hip music for the kids while he's cleaning their teeth and so on and so forth. So it's very easy for him to lure these unsuspecting juvenile delinquents, for lack of a better term, into his chair. But once he straps them into this chair and pulls the switch, it sucks the life force or the essence, if you will, kind of shades of the dark crystal, out of these teens into the chair. And their bodies just miraculously vanish or vaporize. Then he straps himself in the chair and is able to transfer their life power or their essence into himself. This gives him longer life, enables him to stay younger longer, gives him longevity. And it also is slowly building up his ability to be able to manipulate electricity. Soon he figures he won't have to suck the life force out of people and transfer it through his electric chair anymore. He'll just be able to, for all intents and purposes, put his finger in a light socket and juice up, eh?
Wow.
Yes. Very, very, very interesting show. So, of course, throughout the show, our 2 protagonists, who have now teamed up with more of an elder statesman, wise sort of a figure, almost as like a Obi-Wan Kenobi guide, sort of. So now this team has become a trio that are going out to acquire all of these cursed objects, and they get wind of these strange occurrences and a possible sighting of this electric chair at this juvenile detention center. So they set off to retrieve the chair, and of course this entire heinous mystery unfolds before them as they're investigating everything.
Yeah. I'm definitely gonna have to rewatch it again, so because I know there's a lot of symbolism all throughout it, and it's really gonna, because I haven't watched it since having my awareness increased, if you will. So it'll be very interesting to go back with the new eyes and watch it.
And much like the message within the first show I talked about, the kids show, Read All About It, where there's this sort of conspiracy by using advanced technology to sort of dominate over the weak. The same thing here, but rather than it being maybe not necessarily advanced technology, but some kind of alternative type of technology in this chair that he's able to use against the weak in order to strengthen himself. But ultimately, again, it's just to exact his vengeance upon those that he feels didn't do their best to stay his execution those many years ago. So throughout the episode, as he's trying to exact his revenge upon these prison officials and so on, our trio from the antique shop are trying to catch him and stop him and retrieve this chair.
Oh, wow. Very, very interesting. I definitely am gonna have to watch every single episode.
And again, the production value on this show is quite good. The acting is very good, and if you liked X-Files with the Fox Mulder, Dana Scully dynamic, it's very reminiscent of that.
It's intermission time, folks.
It's 5 minutes till showtime. Show starts in 4 minutes.
The show starts in 3 minutes.
It's 2 minutes till showtime.
Just 1 minute to go.
And now, on with the show.
But I saved the best for last for you, Lucius.
Okay, well, light me up. What have you got?
Well, the third show, and I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of this show. It's not quite as obscure as Read All About It, and but maybe not as mainstream as Friday the 13th, but it's definitely rooted in a much deeper of a science fiction element, traditional science fiction. And that's a show called The Star Lost. And this is a Canadian science fiction television show that aired from, what was it, 79? No, sorry. It's 1973 until the beginning of 74, excuse me. There was some juggling and they tried to relaunch the show, and I think eventually it was relaunched. But yeah, it was a Canadian produced science fiction show that was written by Harlan Ellison.
Oh, there's a name we've heard.
Yes. So yeah, no stranger to science fiction by any means. Now, the premise of this television show is that there's a deep space vessel called Earthship Ark. It's a massive starship. It's 50 miles wide and 200 miles long. And within this ship, it contains dozens of separate biospheres that are attached to the outside of the main hull or portion of this ship. And this ship has been launched into deep space because there's some imminent doom on Earth, of course, right? So they've got to pack everybody into these biospheres or biodomes within the ship and set it out into space. But the catch is that each sort of subsect or sub-society within these biospheres is A, unaware that they're in a biosphere on a giant ship called Earthship Ark, and B, they're unaware of the fact that there are other biospheres with other little cultures within them.
Huh. So it sounds similar to Robert Heinlein's Orphans of the Sky or Universe. Very similar.
Yeah, and a little bit of why is the name escaping me? The movie with oh, I lost my train of thought. It'll come to me at 3 a.m. when I'm fast asleep. I'll sit up in bed and yell out the name of the television show or the movie. But anyway, getting back to this, basically what happens is there's three. It's always a trio for some reason, but this ship is launched in the year 2385, and in the year 2790, I believe it is, there's a bit of an accident in space, and 3 of the people within one of these biospheres wake up. And their biosphere is sort of an agrarian Amish type of thing. But they soon realize that they are in one of these biodomes on this big ship, and they realize that there's an emergency. So they've got to try to get to what they figure is the bridge or the main navigational and drive system of this thing so they could steer it to avoid imminent disaster. You know who the star of this television show is, by the way?
Do tell.
Keir Dullea or Dullea of 2001: A Space Odyssey fame.
I'll be David Bowman. They got
David
him
Bowman
back to
himself.
Venus. Wow.
Yeah. He's one of the main 3 cast members on this show, and he actually does an excellent job. In fact, earlier we were discussing 70s era Doctor Who. The production value on this show is very reminiscent of 70s era Tom Baker era Doctor Who. Sort of middle of the road, not too cheap and cheesy looking, but not extremely extravagant. But it's all about the acting, and it's all about the interesting storylines on this show.
Yes, and in my humble opinion, I always thought those were the vastly superior shows, because when you just have wrapping paper and you just have effects, but you don't have the story or the characters or really making it feel real, which was something I always really enjoyed about the Tom Baker adventures, even with their limited budget. They had a good way of making it feel real.
Yes, that's right. Because otherwise it would be, well, we have a saying up here in Alberta, and it's all sizzle and no steak.
Well, I think that's kind of been the trend, especially since the 2000s. I mean, now, well, we don't need to develop a plot. It just needs to be simple, straightforward, have stuff explode, have people run from one explosion to the next. And while it's a bit of a cliche, that's exactly what you see.
Yeah, and have all of your characters in your movie or television show or whatever form of media, comic book or novel, have them be almost perfect right out of the gate, so that it makes it easier to jump from one explosion or car chase to the other. You don't have to have any depth or any fallibility or any failure built into your characters, and therefore no character growth, because hey, they're already perfect. It's a very
Yeah.
boring way to present any kind of fantasy world to the consumer, whether it's television or print or otherwise.
Well, and I think that segues brilliantly into what I think is probably the most important theme behind what we've seen with the change and how science fiction is regarded, how it's supposed to be regarded, and how it's presented to the mass audience compared to, say, the 1960s and the 1980s, seeing a transition starting in the 90s. And then since the 2000s, it's really been full steam ahead to where we've seen the seriousness undercut in a lot of ways with science fiction.
I think a lot of that is predictive programming. They're trying to get everybody around to the idea that out there somewhere, there are these alien overlords that are soon going to come to this planet, and they're going to try to make all of us their enslaved servants. And since the 60s, the seriousness of a lot of these science fiction shows, science fiction material in general, whether it's movies, comic books, television, has gradually been getting more and more serious. And I think originally in the 40s and 50s, a lot of the science fiction subject matter, aside from art films or maybe the earlier era of the 20s and 30s with, Metropolis, for example, but the 40s, 50s, and maybe even the early 60s, it was very campy, B-movie, take your girlfriend to the drive-in movie, but you're not really going to pay attention to the drive-in movie because you're going to try to get to second or third base or whatever the case may be, right? But
Right.
as we've progressed on, it's gotten more serious because the idea behind it, I think, has shifted. And I do think that the predictive programming of trying to get people used to AI, getting used to advanced technology, getting used to being more open to having these AIs and other technologies similar to these assist us in our daily lives. It's going to make your life easier, so on and so forth. And I think it's to bring in the whole transhumanism, where you could start getting implants or chips added to you, or some kind of technological advancement on your body, far beyond a prosthetic arm because you lost yours in an accident, and far beyond the $6 million man. We're getting into some pretty evil scenarios when it comes to a lot of this transhumanism.
Well, you know what? I'm really glad you brought that up because I was actually going to approach it from a completely different theme, but I completely see where you're going with that portion of it being played up as serious for the transhumanism. Because the other element that we really saw in the classic sci-fi, and I'll call out classic Star Trek. People have always loved classic Star Trek. The original 3 seasons, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, the triumvirate, that has always been the benchmark for Star Trek. And of course, when they brought Star Trek back in the 2000s to the big screen, it wasn't the Next Generation, it wasn't the Deep Space Nine, and those were both excellent shows.
Yes.
With huge, huge followings. But they didn't go to them. They went all the way back to classic Star Trek. And I asked myself,
McCoy and Spock.
Yep. And why was that? And what did they really go back and what did they really recover? Well, they put one portion of it quite serious in the new movie. So we're talking about the J.J. Abrams films, although he did the first 2. And then I forget the name of the director, the Fast and the Furious director they brought in to do the third one, which...
Right, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But, that emphasized the explosions, the technology, the bridge of the Enterprise looks like an Apple store, but completely undermined and played it very loosely the actual serious relationships and the experiences of the characters. Because as you were saying, none of the characters in the new films of Star Trek have any sort of growth, have any sort of arc. They vaguely reference it. But I mean, that's all it is. I mean, there's even the joke with Star Trek Into Darkness, the second one of these films. They called it Star Trek Into Reference because who's Khan? I don't know. We've never met him. The characters in the movie. How the heck would they know who he is?
Well, they're relying on a built-in fan base, and they just dangle these member berries in front of you, but that's not enough to sustain an audience for the long term, and that's why the classic Star Trek, even though, as you said, it initially had a very limited run, and we talked about this earlier, that it was really in the reruns or in syndication that it really picked up a lot of steam, because I was too young to watch the original run of that show. I mean, I was born in 1970, so I grew up watching the reruns with my cousins, and oddly enough, we didn't play cops and robbers outside. We played Star Trek.
Well, and you're referring to that time, the early to the mid 80s, and coincidentally, that was also when we were introduced to Doctor Who and the Fourth Doctor, and I'm pretty sure it was the same in Canada. That's when you saw the Fourth Doctor was in the 80s. Am I right?
Yes. Well, Canada has a very close link to Great Britain, and with Doctor Who being a British television show, we got all the British shows, and so Doctor Who was actually quite big in Canada. It played on the CBC network.
Okay.
Yeah, which is our version of the government-funded BBC.
So in the States, it was on public broadcasting stations, and it was always on Friday night at 10:30. I can still remember wherever you were, and you would go and you would watch it on Friday night at 10:30. And it was the same with classic Star Trek. You'd see reruns of that. I think it varied, but for the most part, they were on Saturday. And this was before The Next Generation came out.
Yes.
And that's how a whole generation, you're right, got introduced to it. And it's funny to look back and even see that as early as the original series of Star Trek, they were trying to undercut it already then by making the whole thing seem like a silly farce. I can even think of the first episode they did it, and it wasn't too egregious of an example, was The Trouble with Tribbles.
That just popped into my head when you first started opening up this idea, like 5 seconds ago. That was the first thing that popped in my head, The Trouble with Tribbles, yes.
And it wasn't too bad, but here's the thing. I mean, you compare it with other episodes, and it was in the second season, like The Doomsday Machine or even Bread and Circuses. And I mean, those episodes are just so much more advanced and high concept. And all The Trouble with Tribbles really is it puts Star Trek in kind of a pseudo sitcom mentality. Well, it is a sitcom mentality, really. I mean, the villains aren't too serious. The Klingons played for laughs, and we've got tribbles everywhere. And apparently the guy who wrote it, David Gerald, he had a very inflated ego, and he wrote several novels later where he tried to denigrate Star Trek as much as he could. He thought, oh, it's stupid. Why wouldn't they want my exceptional writing ability?
The other thing I find very interesting about the original Star Trek series compared to how just science fiction in general is viewed today is just how Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future has been flipped on its head. He had a very sort of utopian, almost peaceful vision, with a few exceptions, Klingons and the Romulans and so on. But there was always the idea of trying to establish some kind of communication between the Federation and the Romulans or the Klingons. Whereas now it's all about giant space bugs invading Earth to, farm us humans as some kind of food source. And everything is very, very much turned on its head now and become very dystopian. At least, when a guy like me watches it, that's kind of what I've seen. And that turn, I think, did sort of start to creep in, as we touched on earlier, really, especially in the 90s.
Well, I go back and, take the original series movies, which I think, I liked all 6 movies. I mean, everyone universally agrees 1 and 5 are the weak links, but they still had a lot of those same intentions. And I think you really see it like in Star Trek 3, where Kirk tries to save Krug, the Klingon commander, who killed his son and has just tried to kill him.
Yes.
And he still offers him a hand. Now, granted, he tries to pull him off the cliff and Kirk has to kill him, but that's after all that happened, he still tried to offer him mercy. And I mean, that's a very advanced concept that no, you will not see that in modern Trek at all.
No, in modern Trek, Kirk would kick him in the face and send him plummeting off the cliff edge,
Yeah, he'd go down there and he'd just phaser him and all the rest of the Klingons. And then for good measure, they'd probably go and attack several of the Klingon planets on the border to send a message. Because if you recall Star Trek Discovery, we fire first. It's the Vulcan hello. And I remember seeing that tripe and thinking, what the heck is this? But it actually started with Enterprise when they had the Vulcans acting all irrational and crazy. And it didn't make any sense. Of course, it was still the 2000s, but... And people still try to go back and say, oh, Enterprise was a great show. No, it wasn't. The first 2 seasons were, the plots were just, they went nowhere.
Yeah.
A night in sick bay? I mean, I love animals. I love dogs. But why do we have a Star Trek episode that's centered around the captain's dog? Why?
Yeah, science fiction, a great part of science fiction or any fantasy subgenre is a little bit of escapism. You want to get away from your everyday problems. You want to get away from, I got to pay my internet bill and I got to go to work tomorrow and punch the card for the man or whatever the case may be. And I just want an hour or 2 or whatever time you can set aside for yourself to just immerse into some kind of new world where you can just let go and just enjoy the characters and that entire dimension for what it is and not be constantly pulled out of it, again, whether it's print or film or what have you, because they're interjecting all of these goofy modernisms into something that's current. It's current day modernisms as opposed to future modernisms. You know what I mean? They're not speculating on anything of what's going to be modern 2,000 years from now in these science fiction shows. They're interjecting current day into something that's supposed to take place in a fantasy world in the future. And it pulls you out, or at least to me, it pulls me out. I'm thinking, what is the guy thinking when he's writing this show? You know what I mean?
Well, it's like now they're trying to make it as contemporary as possible. And you take the example of the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation, even with all its flaws, they still tried to really make that show feel futuristic. It still felt like they were really cruising around the galaxy. Now, yes, some of the stuff they did was questionable. Picard surrendering all the time was a little bizarre. I know they were trying to pull back from what they had in the original series, and then finally they got away from that and really balanced it with the writing. But for whatever reason, 1996, that's really the benchmark year where it felt like Star Trek just started to really tip over. It was after First Contact, where you started to see that they just couldn't get out of referencing themselves. The last truly original show was Deep Space Nine, and then when it ended. And then since then, it's just been as though we're constantly going back and redoing all the Star Trek that's already been done, or it's a prequel. Like that was the flaw with Enterprise. Well, who wants to see a prequel? Nobody wants to see prequels. Tell a new story.
If I want to know about Captain Christopher Pike, I can watch the 2-part episode from the original series.
Exactly. We don't need to see a series about Captain Pike. And oddly enough, we've actually managed to immensely diminish Captain Pike by this series.
Well, see, what happens is they overcorrected on their course correction in modern day, right? Do they see the thing about good old Bill Shatner, who's a Canadian, so I got to shout out a fellow Canuck, is that he was, and to some extent McCoy, actually, for the most part, all of the male ensemble, with maybe the stoicism of Spock set aside. They were very, they were too in your face, alpha male type characters, and that doesn't fly too well today in the modern era. So what they had to do was they had to course correct with Picard, but they overcorrected. And I think you touched on it when you noticed that Captain Picard in the Star Trek The Next Generation seemed to, put his hands over his head and give up way too often. He was a little bit too soft, which was an overcorrection too much from a little bit of a carefree sort of risk-taking alpha male like Captain Kirk.
Well, and I'll even go past, and go past the traditional designations. I mean, really what you're falling into, it's not even who's alpha and who's not. It's about having people who act like individuals. That's really what they're walking back from, I think.
Yes.
They know that They don't want you to be an individual. Captain Kirk was an individual. Spock was an individual. McCoy was an individual. Well, we can't have that. We have to have people who are part of greater groups. And that's really been the big difference that we've seen. And that's why they always want to go back and revisit the classic Star Trek. Oh, well, you had people who were individuals. We can't have that. And then,
yes,
of course,
having free-thinking individuals that are given their own agency. Yes, of course not.
That's it. That's exactly it. I mean, now you watch it and it's like, what's the agency? It's really, really bizarre. I mean, none of it even makes any sense, but it's been happening since Enterprise. I mean, nobody talks about how wonderful Captain Archer is and how amazing he was.
It did have a pretty good head of hair. Come on, and that's
right. Nothing against Scott Bakula. He's a marvelous actor, and he was great in Quantum Leap.
Sure,
but the way they wrote the character in the show, I mean, it was just what is this guy doing?
It behooves a guy to try to outguess what a lot of these showrunners and writers are doing. And I know a lot of it is, again, they're written by committee and they got answered on high from more and more money being thrown at it from these bigger and bigger corporate studios and so on and so forth. So, I mean, long gone, I think, are the days of shows like Friday the 13th, the series, or Star Trek, the original series, or The Star Lost. Maybe in print, novellas and that sort of thing, you'll still see a lot of that sort of idea and these topics discussed. But in major streaming service platforms or major motion pictures, I think hopefully the pendulum swings back to, character-driven stories where these characters have agency and they actually have character arcs. But I think it's going to be a while yet before that pendulum swings back, unfortunately.
Right. Well, and I think you identified it really well. And I mean, it was probably even earlier than the 90s because I think of how Doctor Who ended. I mean, Sylvester McCoy, the Seventh Doctor, he was a fine doctor. But a lot of the seeds for this, for where they wanted to tell stories that had political implications behind them, contemporary political implications, that actually started with the writer they brought in for the last 2 seasons of Sylvester McCoy. If you ever saw that Doctor Who episode, The Happiness Patrol?
No, I'm not familiar with that one.
Well, virtually nobody saw it because it's not considered a good episode. I mean, there were good Sylvester McCoy episodes, but that was not one of them. And it shows the intention of the writers, where their primary intention is not to tell a good story; it's to make a point. It's to make a political point. It's to tell you how to live your life. It's to showcase this or that. That started then, and it gradually creeped its way across all the bands of science fiction. And here we are today. And so we don't have the focus being on a good story. The focus is to conform to the prevalent ideologies of the present.
Do you think that the shortened attention span has something to do with this as well, where not a lot of people, and I don't want to pick on any sort of generations, but it seems like some folks in some of the younger generations, because I'm in my mid-50s, it seems like they're perhaps not willing to invest the time, or they don't have the patience to sit through more of a slow burn, character-developed, character-driven show that has episodic character arcs, but then overall seasonal and then overall series story arcs that, they're not willing to, push off their instant gratification. It's got to be that quick, TikTok sort of dopamine dump as quickly as possible, as opposed to investing time and energy in really following along and fully immersing yourself in a show. So therefore the showrunners decide, well, we're going to just cater to this sort of McDonald's mentality of fast food television, whether it's science fiction or any other genre.
Well, I'll go one further. I mean, you can see it most effective with generations because different people had different experiences, but it's honestly been branded on all of us to try to reduce our attention spans.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree.
Because if you reduce attention spans, it's a lot easier to change what people are thinking in real time. And a lot easier
to obscure the past as well. You can hide the past a lot more more easily if somebody's just living in the moment and they're just looking for the next quick little dopamine dump, as opposed to, really taking time to study.
Well, just look at how a place like McDonald's isn't even about providing even close to quality food anymore. Or, you could even argue doesn't even have food content.
Yeah, can you actually call that food? That's up for debate, I think.
Well, I mean, every morsel comes in a case of some sort, so make of it what you will.
I mean, it is presented to you. I mean, they do take steps to give you some kind of visual presentation. It's not just, getting back to 2001, it's not just different segments on a TV tray of, different colored mush, although it's pretty close.
Right, but I think there is a lot to do with that, and I think it all comes down to we just want a more malleable population. That okay, this is what we told you yesterday, but now we can tell you something that's completely different today, and you're going to abide by it because,
Sure.
Well, your attention span isn't that long anyway, and it's the path of least resistance. Especially if authority is saying something, well, we better go along with it, and we don't want to go against the grain. So whatever you tell us to think and do, we think and do. It's easy.
Yep, the powers who should not be will be like, all right, you dumb goldfish brains, don't worry about it. We'll tell you what to think yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We got you covered. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, pretty much. And here's what you're going to worry about. We're going to give that to you, and even if it contradicts what we told you last week or today, you're not going to ask because this is what the current results are telling us. And only experts can tell you what to think about things. Don't think for yourself. Whatever you do.
Right, and if you dare to stand up and think for yourself, well, there's going to be some kind of consequences, so they're going to treat you like a Pavlovian pooch, and eventually you're going to learn that, when that bell rings, you just got to you're going to be conditionally classically conditioned to respond in a certain way. Excuse my flubbing.
Well, and I think that's the real reason. That's the real danger from what they saw with these earlier shows where you had individuals like Captain Kirk, Spock, McCoy, the Fourth Doctor, and others who would relentlessly question authority, who would question things that didn't make sense, who saw the bigger picture, who constantly tried to find deeper meaning in every single experience. There's no deeper meaning in any of these experiences we see in these modern science fiction shows.
No, not at all. It's not like the that getting back to the Star Lost. I mean, the one episode was known as the Implant People, and if anybody dared stand up against the authority figure in that episode, the implant was in the temple of their head, and they would receive excruciating mental and physical pain if they dared challenge the status quo or even voice a free thought. If they didn't fall in line, the villain of that episode would press a little button on a little remote he carried with him all the time. And, whoever he wants to inflict this pain upon would feel it through this implant. So everybody was subjugated instantaneously once they all got the implants, except for the villain of the show. Of course, he was implant free.
Naturally. Yes. And you remember when there was a time that, you were supposed to question that ideology. You were supposed to question the total authoritarianism, the age-old cry of the oppressor. It was a matter of internal security. And now they bandy that about every single day, everywhere. It's a matter of internal security. Don't question it. Oh, okay. It's not the cry of the oppressor. It's merely a sensible approach.
Yes, and we all do feel safer when we're being sensible, don't we?
Yes, exactly. It could be dangerous if you question things. So I think great examples and wonderful connections with science fiction to the old world. And I think the reason why they were allowed to refer to the old world more in science fiction is it's crazy fantasy. And Gene Roddenberry said it himself. Well, people won't take it too seriously because it seems all make-believe, even though the ideas are very serious. The personal relationships and the personal journeys, those are very serious too.
I would agree 100%. And yeah, I think it's much easier for some of these more gifted writers and showrunners, such as Harlan Ellison, to be able to supplant these little warnings about the speed of technology and how it could be used against us in some of these shows because, like you said, they were science fiction. It wasn't taken seriously. It was silly spacemen, little green men from Mars type stuff. So, hey, who in the heck with any, who's in their right frame of mind would ever take that seriously, right? So there's something to be said, I think, for a little bit of the obscurity or the slightly off-center nature of science fiction, especially in the sort of the heyday of the 60s, 70s, getting into the 80s and 90s.
Oh, that's a great note to end on, and thank you so much for joining me, New West Reset.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for your time and for just putting together this entire topic of discussion. Excellent. It's right up my alley. I'm kind of a space boy myself, so
I think we all are at the end of the day.